In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we are now at the third lesson in this mini-series that has to do with the prophethood of our Prophet, the special prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this lesson is directly related to the topic of the authenticity of the Holy Qur'an. So there was kind of an introductory lesson where we talked in general about the prophethood of the Holy Prophet, and then we started talking about his main miracles. So the second lesson had to do with the miraculous nature of the Holy Qur'an. And it seemed that we had too much content to cover, so we split it in two parts. And now we are at the third lesson of this mini-series. So this one has directly to do with the authenticity of the Holy Qur'an. In other words, to what extent can we rely on this book that we call the Qur'an as being the actual original revelation that was given to Prophet Muhammad, and is the one that we currently have today the same as the one that early Muslims had access to when Islam initially began? So a couple of words just about the overview of the lesson. There's an introduction, and then basically once the introduction is done, the author concentrates on the argument from two aspects, two angles. He wants to establish clearly and give you, or give the reader, an argument or a proof that there is no addition to the Holy Qur'an. There is nothing added to the Holy Qur'an on top of the original revelation or the original communication. So that's part of establishing that it is authentic. And the other part of it is establishing that there was no omission. So there's nothing missing. So he establishes an argument for that side of the equation. And we'll see that there's a part of the argument, or some arguments, depending on how you want to look at it, that overlap, and a part that can be looked at separately for each one of these, let's say half of the argument. And then we'll complement with a lot more than what is said in the lesson, because I think the lesson goes a little bit quickly over this topic, and it's a very important topic. So before the lesson, I just wanted to kind of go back to the previous lesson with 2 points, and then we'll go quickly to the lesson. And I don't want to spend too much time on this. The first one is in reaction to a comment that I received, or a question that I received concerning the previous 2 lessons. Or let's just put it this way, it's an objection. So if what we're saying about the Holy Qur'an is true, and what we said is that the Holy Qur'an is a miracle, it has a miraculous nature, and we provided a number of different ways in which the Holy Qur'an is miraculous. One of the things we talked about was the types of content or the type of facts that we find in the Holy Qur'an, and we said that they fall in different categories. And for some of them, we can lump them all together under the general heading of, let's say, scientific facts. Today we would call it the natural world or natural science, and we gave multiple examples from geology, meteorology, embryology, and so on and so forth. So the argument or the objection would go as follows. If it's true that the Holy Qur'an contains these scientific miracles as Muslims claim, then how come is it that we don't find that the Muslims are the ones making these discoveries, and that they're relying on the other scientists, non-Muslim scientists, who don't have necessarily access to the Holy Qur'an? So this most likely means that the Holy Qur'an does not contain these miraculous scientific facts as one would claim. In general, that's the argument. So I thought I'd just comment very quickly on this. This is a big topic too, and it would require a lengthy discussion. But just a couple of topics, just a couple of points so that we don't leave that objection hanging, and then we move to the next thing. So the first thing is, as we said, the Holy Qur'an is not a scientific textbook. It's not a textbook of science. So even if it talks about this or that scientific truth, it's not going to present it in the scientific language of today, for instance, nor is it going to explain it as though it's a mathematical or physical equation. This is not a book of science. It's a book of spiritual guidance. So when the Holy Quran talks about whatever it talks about, even the things that we consider as falling under, the general heading of natural science, the point is not that this is natural science. The point is that it's trying to draw your attention to the manner in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the world, has created the universe, the magnificent, splendid, precise order and design that we find in the world. That's what the Holy Quran is trying to do. So these can be considered more as allusions, references to things that are supposed to make you think, supposed to make you meditate and reflect and go study more and explore them on your own. And we talked about this at length in previous lessons when we said, when it comes to the natural order of things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the tools to explore the universe. We have enough that we are supposed to be able to go and explore the universe ourselves. This is not the purpose of sending a religion to humankind. The purpose is not to explain to us the laws of biology or astronomy or whatever else falls under natural science. We should have, as human beings, the tools between the empirical tools that we have, the five senses we have, and the reason and the logic that we've been given. We should be able to explore nature and to find out its secrets and come up with laws and theories and models to make it work. The whole Quran is not meant for those things. That's the first thing. A second thing is we have to be careful when we talk about scientific miracles in the Holy Quran. There are some of our scholars, and I lean a little bit towards that, we have to define very clearly what we mean when we say that it's a scientific miracle. The fact that the Holy Quran refers to let's call it a scientific fact, and I'll come back to that in a second. If the Holy Quran refers to something and we consider that to be a scientific fact, it's not the fact itself that is necessarily the miracle. And we talked a little bit about that, but let me repeat it so that we answer this objection. The miracle is that this came from that type of man living in that type of world, which is Prophet Muhammad living 14 centuries ago in that type of context. That man should not have been able to access that type of information. To know, for instance, that the heavens are constantly expanding. Where would he get that type of information from? Or the embryology that, with centuries was discovered in a lot more detail, and today they're linking a lot of the verses of the Qur'an with genetics and other fields. That type of knowledge should not have been accessible to someone like him. So, to say that it's only the actual mentioning of something in the Qur'an that becomes the miracle, that may be problematic. And the reason it's problematic is, as we said, combined with what we said previously, the whole Qur'an is giving you general principles. It's giving you a key. It's talking about a high-level truth about the way in which the world is created to draw your attention to it. But it's not necessarily presented to you in a scientific language so that you can go to the lab and test it as is. You take the verse and test it. It requires a little bit of work. And that work depends on you. So not everybody who's going to read that is going to be at the same level. People are going to fall in different categories. The more you know about nature, the more you may be able to extract something from the verses that talk about nature. If you know nothing and you read the verse, it won't help you that much. So you'll believe in what it's saying, but you won't necessarily be able to draw some sort of scientific theory or conclusion from it. Okay, so that's a second point. A third point related to this is that, and this would require a series of lectures on what is science. When we say something is scientific, what do we mean? We can't just jump into the conclusion that because there's a kind of a general consensus in the community of scientists at a given time about something, then that becomes an absolute truth. And anyone who studies a little bit how science is constructed, and that's what science is, it's a construction, it's a social human construction, it's your best interpretation of your observation and experience at a given time. And that's why they create a model. So if today, for instance, you look at the world and you hear from a physicist or people who are studying cosmology or astronomy, they'll tell you, for instance, that the math works, the equations work, we have a pretty good understanding of the universe, except that when we look at what we see and what we understand, and when we do our calculations, it seems like there's about 85% of the weight of the universe that is just not there. And for the math and the science to make sense, we're missing 85% of the matter that we're supposed to be able to see in the universe, and it's not there. So what do? We're going to create a notion, a variable, and we're going to plug it in there. We're going to say this is going to represent 85% of everything that we're not seeing, and we're going to call it dark matter. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it works. We're just going to park it there. Another way to look at this, if you want to be a little bit more philosophical and critical, is to say the truth is we're kind of not understanding 85% of what we're looking at right now. So it's easy to say we have reached a scientific truth. But most likely in a couple of generations or centuries, maybe this notion of dark matter will not exist because we'll understand what it really is. Today we don't. But in today's model, we have something called dark matter. We have something called gravity. We have something called electromagnetism. It's our best interpretation of what we're seeing. Tomorrow we may come up with a theory that explains it a lot better than what we currently have, and that will become the scientific truth. As before, gravity was not understood as we understand it today. You go back 5 centuries, gravity was something completely different. You go 20 centuries in the time of Aristotle, it was something completely different. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind when people say the things that are discovered are in the Holy Qur'an are matching scientific truths. So on the one side, those attacking the Holy Qur'an from the outside, saying that this is not a book of God, because it's not matching scientific truths, well, first establish that it's a truth, and then we'll talk. That's one. And on the other side, when Muslims say, let's take an example. In Surah Al-Ra'd, we have a verse that says, Allah, the one who has raised the heavens with columns that you do not see. Allah الذي رفع السماوات بغير عمد ترونها. He has raised the heavens with columns or without columns that you can see. We can come up with all sorts of interpretations to this. We go to the narrations, we find that someone came to Imam Ali alayhi salam and he asked him, is the Holy Qur'an in this verse saying that the heavens, and of course our scholars and there's narrations that say the heavens could mean the space that we're looking at, or it could mean the astronomical bodies, so it could be stars or planets. Both can be referred to as samawat. Is the Holy Qur'an, the man is asking Imam Ali alayhi salam, is it saying that there are columns but we do not see them, or is it saying there are no columns? Because the verse is kind of ambiguous. بِغَيْرِ عَمَدٍ تَرَوْنَهَا. Without columns that you can see. So are there no columns? Or there are columns but we don't see them? So Imam Ali alayhi salam answers and he tells him, there are columns and we cannot see them, and he repeats the verse to him to make it clear. And he says they are made of nur, they are made of a light that we cannot see. Today, a lot of scholars have taken this and they say very quickly, this is a theory of gravity. We do not see gravity, so it's a force. This is the nur that Imam Ali alayhi salam is talking about. There's some sort of force, some sort of reality that becomes the foundation that holds the universe together. And then the verse makes a lot more sense based on contemporary or modern science. Very nice. The problem, the danger with this, is that if in a little while we discover that our understanding of the theory of gravity is wrong, does it mean that the Qur'an was wrong in the way it explained how the universe is created? No. This is where we say, or I say, be careful when you say the Qur'an is matching what science is discovering. Science is always going to be changing. Before you jump to the conclusion that this is what the Qur'an is saying, make sure that this is an actual truth. Otherwise, that's your best interpretation of what that verse is saying. And it may change tomorrow because your science has changed. And then maybe a last point, because usually people, when they're attacking this, they're attacking religion in general and the state of Islam in general. And I will be the first to say that I think Islam as an institution, I don't think anyone who's objective and who looks at Islam as an institution in the world wouldn't agree with me that it's kind of in a state of crisis. Today, if you look at the different fields of science and technology and industry, you can find all of those foundations for those fields. They were established in the dark ages of Europe, the medieval times of Europe, by Islamic scientists and scholars. Today, we have a crisis, and we're not going to go into what the crisis, all the different types of crisis that we have. We live in a complex world. It would be very difficult for someone just to sit at home and read the Qur'an and come up with all sorts of theories that will change the world. It's not as simple as that. You need research teams and labs and technology and the funding and the countries and the policies and everything behind it to actually make significant advances to science. But this does not necessarily mean that there's a lack in the Qur'an or that the keys or the principles are useless if they are found in the Qur'an. The problem is with the Muslims and with the state of the Islamic world that we're not even able to match what we were doing in the Dark Ages in terms of institutions and working together. Who says that those scholars, someone needs to do that colossal study, go back through the lives, the biographies of the scholars of the Muslim world, people who were working on math and astronomy and physics and chemistry during the Dark Ages of Europe, to see, is it true that they discovered all of this without some sort of keys given to them from the Qur'an or not? Did the Qur'an and the truths in the Qur'an, did they play a role in leading scientists in a certain direction as opposed to another or not? And we need experts who do that work. It's not a simple work. People who are in the field of chemistry will work on chemistry to see how our scientists synthesize alcohol, for instance, or how Khwarizmi worked on optics, or how they worked on math, or so on and so forth. Okay, so that's a whole field on its own. It's too cheap to say today, someone would just look at the truths, scientific truths of the Qur'an to say, well, since Muslims today are not the ones leading the scientific journey of humanity, therefore we're going to dismiss everything in the Qur'an as, these are not miraculous scientific facts. And as I said, we have to be careful internally too, as Muslims, when we're saying these are scientific truths equal miracle, we have to be careful how we qualify that and how we present that. So that's all to wrap up the previous topic. And then the second thing, and in the last lesson, unfortunately, I think there was a little bit of a technical difficulty in the version that was sent in the slides. There was this theme that was not really mentioned in detail in the lesson that I thought is worth mentioning. We talked about different aspects that the Holy Qur'an may be considered miracles. We mentioned a few. One of them that the Holy Qur'an is very well known for and could be used to study it extensively are all the prophecies mentioned in the Holy Qur'an. So these are things that the Holy Qur'an mentions before they happen, and they actually happen later. So even if we wanted to put aside all the other aspects of the miraculous nature of the Qur'an, and I'm mentioning this because maybe someone doesn't want to spend too much time studying Arabic and understanding the eloquence and the rhetoric of the Qur'an, for instance. Well, this is one more field. So here I wrote very quickly a few of the well-known prophecies in the Qur'an. So one of them is the return of the Holy Prophet to Mecca. If someone, and the important thing to keep in mind here is, and we don't have time to go through the story related to each one of these prophecies, but the bottom line, and the reason why I mentioned these, is that anyone living in that context may not have seen this as being the future. Sometimes anyone who's in a certain context is going to be able to read the context, the horizon, put it together, and say, so this should happen 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. I'm not sure when, but in the future, this is where we're headed. There's nothing really surprising when you do that, and it actually happens. What's surprising is if you're able to come up with a conclusion and say and predict this is what's going to happen in the future when all the indications are pointing in the other direction. And in these verses, this is what we have. If someone really understands how the Holy Prophet lived in Mecca after announcing his prophetic mission, and how he was chased out after multiple assassination attempts, it would be difficult for someone to see how the Qur'an promises the Holy Prophet that you are going to go back to Mecca. The one who has revealed the Qur'an to you is going to bring you back to Mecca. So that's the first verse. Okay? And this is years before the Holy Prophet can go back to Mecca as a victor. That's one. A second group of verses, and there's a few of them, This is now not only talking to the Holy Prophet, it's talking to the Muslims in general. When it says, certainly Allah has fulfilled His Apostle's vision in all truth, you shall most certainly enter the sacred mosque. This is when the Muslims were promised in a vision from the Holy Prophet that they're going to perform the pilgrimage. And they went and they were stopped in the way. They could not enter. The polytheists in Mecca would not allow them to enter to perform the pilgrimage. So they went back. It resulted in a peace treaty with them for that time, and they went back. But the Holy Qur'an is promising you. Who knows what's going to happen? But the Holy Qur'an is clear, adamant before it happens. It says, you shall most certainly enter the sacred mosque, God willing, in safety. So it's even describing their psychological state. In safety, with your heads shaven or hair cropped, without any fear. So anyone who comes and says, I'm scared, as we're entering, then you have refuted the verse. All you need is that. As the verse was revealed, with so many people around being enemies of Prophet Muhammad and his mission, you only need one person to come and dispute this, refute this verse, and it's over. You've shown that there's a prophecy that did not actually happen. Another verse. Very early, Abu Lahab was very open to, in his confrontation to the Holy Prophet and his mission. And the Qur'an was very clear from the beginning. تَبَّتْ يَدَا أَبِي لَهَبٍ وَتَبَّ. May the hand of Abu Lahab perish and may he perish. Okay, what if Abu Lahab becomes Muslim? The whole Qur'an is going to have to come back with different verses to change, or what? No, this is a prophecy. It means this man is going to die in this state. He's never going to enter Islam. When everybody else, there are people who are thinking about it. Some people were known to be sworn enemies and they entered, and I'll mention one of them a little bit later, including Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was fighting against Islam at the beginning, and then he entered. Okay, why wouldn't the Holy Qur'an say that about other people? Why did it say that about Abu Lahab? All Abu Lahab needs to do to dispute the Qur'an is to say, I've become a Muslim. And the Qur'an is refuted. Right? And this is very early on. There are multiple verses for the Battle of Badr. One of them is when the Holy Qur'an was telling the people of the Prophet about the people of Mecca in their might and the height of their enmity towards the Muslims who had just ran away from them. They were all arrogant and proud about the alliances that they had created, Quraysh with all of the other tribes, to come and kill the Holy Prophet and the Muslims. And the Qur'an says, or do they say, we are a victorious alliance. The alliance will be defeated and they will turn their backs fleeing. And this happened right before the Battle of Badr. And there are other verses in the Qur'an about this too. The descendants of the Prophet, and this is well-known stories, when they would mock the Holy Prophet saying that he has no descendants because they only look at male descendants, and the Holy Prophet's son, Abdul Rahman, had just died, so they started mocking him. So when the Qur'an replied with Surah Al-Kawthar, all the scholars of the world, and Fakhr Razi has a beautiful saying in his tafsir in which he says, when you look, he says, don't only look at the amount of progeny that the Holy Prophet has today. Keep in mind the enmity that was against them throughout the ages, and how much people and different emperors and different tyrants and different kings tried to exterminate him and his entire progeny. The name of the Holy Prophet was fought against. They tried to exterminate his name. And if you go back to history and you see what was done to Sayyids, the line of the Holy Prophet, it's a miracle that any of them exist. And what you find out is that their numbers are in the millions or tens of millions or more today. Okay? So Fakhr Razi talks about this a little bit, but this is Surah Al-Kawthar. We have given you the abundance, which has many, many interpretations, but the literal meaning is abundance, Al-Kawthar. So pray to your Lord and sacrifice the sacrificial camel, for instance. It is your enemy who is without posterity. Okay, and then the last verse that we have here is the entire story between the Romans and Persia. The Muslims saw themselves a lot closer to the Romans because the Romans were Christians. So they liked them, and they wanted them to be victorious over Persia. But this is when the Roman Empire was in decline very quickly. And they were beaten by the Persians on their land, which was really showing the decline of the Roman Empire at that time. Not only were they beaten, they were beaten in their land, in their homeland, in the heart of their kingdom. So anyone who would see this happening would not predict that the Romans are going to be victorious. And this is when the Muslims started to debate and be very preoccupied what's going to happen to them if the Persians are beating the Romans. Maybe the Muslims are going to be next, they're going to attack them. And so the verses of Surah Al-Rum were revealed. The first 6 verses of Surah Al-Rum. Alif Lam Mim, Ghulibat Al-Rum. Yes, Byzantium has been defeated. Ghulibat Al-Rum fi adna al-ard. There's different interpretations. The lowest line, or in their heartland. Fi adna al-ard. In the innermost part of their land, they were beaten. That's true. غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون. And after this defeat of theirs, they are going to be victorious. في بضع سنين, in a few years. And the few doesn't do justice to the Arabic, because in Arabic, بضع specifically means between 3 and 9. It cannot be 10, it cannot be 2, it cannot be 12, because that's not بضع in Arabic. في بضع سنين. That's why we say, when you don't have the Arabic, you miss on some things. How do you translate that? Between 3 and 9 years. Okay, the Holy Qur'an uses that a lot. And you have to be very careful how the Qur'an uses it. في بضع سنين. 9 years later, they were victorious. Yeah.
Even a small comment. في أدنى الأرض, it also maybe heard of it. The أدنى means the lowest point of the earth, and it actually is the lowest point of the earth in Palestine. It's 250 meters under
below the sea
level. Yeah. So there's double miracle.
Or more. There's other meanings too. Yes. We're just going very quickly here. This is years. 9 years before it says they will be victorious. And then the verse continues, all command belongs to Allah before and after. And on that day, this is the second prophecy. People associate that part with the victory of the Romans. But if you're very careful how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying the words, and on that day the believers shall rejoice with what? يومئذ يفرح المؤمنون بنصر الله. So there's a victory from God. Okay, one way to interpret it is to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helped the Romans beat the Persians. But this is actually happening at the same time as the Battle of Badr. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying when that will happen, when that battle between the Persians and the Romans will happen, that second one, where the Romans are now going to be victorious, is going to be happening at the same time as another victory granted to you from God, which is the Battle of Badr. So the timing is a lot more precise than what it may seem to be saying. He helps whomever He wishes, and He is Almighty, All-Merciful. That is the promise of Allah. See, so it's a very open, clear prophecy. No one can come back and say, it's iffy, it's not sure. Allah does not break His promise, but most people do not know. Anyway, so this was just simply to wrap up the previous topic. Now today's topic is the authenticity of the Holy Quran. In the introduction, first points first, we established that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He has created humankind, then it is a logical necessity that He also guides them. And that's how we established the necessity of prophethood. And we said as part of prophethood, there needs to be some sort of communication that allows human beings to be guided. So that was a necessity of revelation. When we talked about that, we said there's different ways to look at revelation. One of them is, let's look at the chain of transmission. And we said the chain of transmission from Allah, from the source, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all the way to the time that the revelation is actually communicated to the people, we need to have an infallible chain of transmission. No one can start creating these stories about, let's say, devils or jinn or things happening in the way to the revelation between God and human beings, for instance. Right? We need to establish that point first. And that, we spend enough time on it, we're not going to go back to it. So the question should not be about the revelation between the time Allah releases it, or the communication chain begins from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the time a holy prophet communicates that revelation. That part we've already established. There's a logical necessity for it. Otherwise, we have a problem with the issue of prophethood entirely. Okay. So the issue we have then is, once that revelation has been communicated to people, how do we know that this is the actual revelation? Especially if you're not there. If you're hearing it, great. What if you're a century later? What if you're 10 centuries later? So now our question is not about that part, because we've already established that. It's what happens next. And when we look at the previous revelations, previous scriptures, we know that there were huge issues with them. Today, if we look at the revelations of previous prophets, for instance, there's no one in the world who will even claim to say, for instance, I have the scripture of the revelation that was given to Prophet Ibrahim or Prophet Nuh. They're entirely lost. And when we look, and we talked a little bit about this already, when we looked at the revelations that were given to Prophet Isa alayhi salam or Prophet Musa alayhi salam, it would be very difficult for someone to say this is the actual revelation that they received. And anyone who spends a little bit of time reading it, you'll see that these are accounts about them, about their lives, very similar to what we have in our sunnah. And we're a lot more rigorous the way we transmit our sunnah and study it than they are with their scriptures, especially in the early times. So when we put all of that together, we have a very big problem when it comes to revelations. So when we come to the Qur'an, we have to see to what extent does it fall in the same problem, and if it doesn't, then how? In what way? What's our proof? What's our evidence or argument that it has not fallen to the same problem? One quick thing that we can mention already is that if it is properly established that that Islam is an actual religion of God, and that it's the last of religions, then it becomes necessary to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will preserve this revelation or this scripture. That becomes a logical necessity. We're not going to make that argument, but that's a side argument that you can also keep in mind. Okay? So again, I'll repeat it very quickly. If it is well established to someone that Islam is an actual divine religion, that it has been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the issue is only about whether the revelation is the authentic one or not, then here we open the door to the logical necessity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensuring that this revelation stays intact. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem with prophethood itself. If we're agreeing that this is a final religion. So this has a direct link with Al-Khatamiyya. Is Islam the final religion? If it is, then we need something to preserve it, or its main miracle, or its main teachings, which are the Holy Quran. And if you lose that, then you lose the purpose of having something sent to human beings as a guidance. And we are all now, if everything is equal and all religions are equal, and there's no way to tell anything apart from anything, then we've basically disqualified and all that whole argument for the necessity of prophethood. Okay? So keep that in mind. So what about the Holy Quran? The author here, and I'll come back to this point, he says the importance of the Holy Quran to anyone who studies the history of Islam should be well established. So if anyone looks at the importance that the Holy Prophet gave to the Holy Quran, that the Imams, for instance, gave to the Holy Quran, the scholars, the Muslims gave to the Holy Quran, how they learned it, how they would count not only every verse and not only every word, they would count we have treaties written to explain how many letters are in the Quran, very, very early in Islam. This is the care that Muslims took. So if you take into consideration the historical dimension of the Holy Quran, that alone should remove any doubts to anyone's mind that the Holy Quran is the actual authentic book from the time of the Holy Prophet until now. So given that, the author says, I'm going to look at another type of argument. So I'm going to concentrate on something a little bit more rational, scriptural, to determine whether the Holy Quran that we have, we can consider it authentic or not. And that's two questions. So he summarizes as two questions. Is it possible that there are additions, anything that was added to the original Quran that was not part of it? And two, is it possible that there were any omissions from the Quran, anything that was removed? So we start with the addition. The first thing he says is that there is a unanimity. All the scholars of Islam are in agreement. Anyone who has studied the Quran should be in agreement that there is not a single word, a single verse that has ever been added to the Holy Quran. No one has ever made that claim. Whatever was revealed to Prophet Muhammad and what was passed down, no one has ever said there's anything added to the Holy Quran. So that on its own counts for something. But let's add to it. Let's add a rational argument. So he says the rational argument is either we say, if there is an addition to the Holy Quran, either we say that it is a full notion that was added, or we say it's something very minor. So we start with the full notion. He says, if it were true that anything could ever be added to the Holy Quran, and it would be a full topic, a full notion, explained well in the Holy Quran, it would mean that the Holy Quran is not the miracle that it claims to be, because anyone could duplicate it and insert into it without anyone finding it. And because there's agreement that its style, its rhetoric, its eloquence, and so on and so forth are unmatchable, are inimitable, no one can imitate them, duplicate them, then that becomes a rational argument to show that no one can introduce into the Quran an entire notion, an entire theme, a few verses together that talk about anything. That's one. And what about the minor? So what about a word here and there? What about a letter here and there? Well, this is where you would have to go back into a little bit more detail and say it will break with the style of the Quran. It will break with the rhetoric of the Quran. The scholars who have spent their lives studying the Arabic aspect of the Quran would find out right away. Because no one can actually play around with a letter, a single letter of a single word in the Quran. If you manipulate, if you modify one letter in the Quran, the meaning changes. And you can tell, in the majority of cases, you can tell that there was a break in the style, in the rhythm, and the eloquence and rhetoric of the Quran in general. So here he, of course, comes back to the general argument here, is that because the Holy Quran is not imitable, you cannot duplicate it, it is impossible, this is the rational argument, it would be impossible for someone to add anything as a full notion into it. And this is why the verse is added here. So this was one of the verses we used to establish the challenge of the Holy Quran, as well as its miraculous nature, that it's not possible to duplicate it, so it would also not be possible to duplicate a part of it. Otherwise, that would mean that you could duplicate it. Okay? And if it's something very minor, then it would disrupt the style, the meaning, the eloquence, rhetoric, and so on and so forth. That's what he presents for the addition. So there are no additions to the Holy Quran. Are there any omissions? This one is a little bit more tricky. This one is a little bit more, requires a little bit more discussion.
What does omission
Omission means there's something that was removed. Something that's missing from the initial scripture. Today, the majority of scholars are unanimous that there are no omissions in the Holy Quran. But here is where I've added that it is actually a very contentious issue. Why? Because there are many narrations. The big claim, the one that everybody hears about, is that there are narrations in the Shia tradition that say the Holy Quran is missing parts. There are things that were removed from the Quran for all sorts of reasons. Okay? That's one. The problem is, this is not just limited to Shia narrations. In the Sunni school, we have as many narrations as we find in the Shia school saying there were things missing. That what we have today from the Holy Quran, especially if you look into the way it was compiled and so on and so forth, it does not have the full content that it had at the time of the Prophet. There are narrations in both schools, in Islam in general, that talk about things missing from the original Quran. So what do we do about that? Yeah.
Should I ask later? Or?
Well, yeah, go ahead. Ask.
It's in regards to all these hadith that say that there are omissions from the Quran. Is there any particular theme that they claim that these omissions include? Like a certain section of the Quran is missing that was talking about such and such a theme or such and such a topic.
Yeah.
And are those topics common between, say, the Sunni hadith and the Shia hadith?
Yeah, so there are, it's an excellent question. They actually fall into different categories. So some categories, yes, they overlap. For instance, and you can look at Al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Qur'an, the prolegomena to the Qur'an of Sayyid al-Khou'i. He has a slightly more detailed, in Arabic there is a lot of works, but this one in English is actually pretty good, and I'll mention another source a little bit later that talks about it from the Sunni perspective as well. And he categorizes them, I believe, in either 4 or 5 categories. And you will see that some of them are common to both. So for instance, the manner in which it was compiled into a book, well, there are issues there. If you look at the manner in which it was compiled, and was it compiled entirely, or were there parts missing, and did they come later, and they did not know where to put them, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's a theme. That could be for both. In the Shia school, of course, there were narrations that say that there were verses in the Quran specifically mentioning Imam Ali alayhi salam or others by name, and those with time were removed from the Quran by the enemies. When there are other narrations that clearly state that none of the names of Ahlul Bayt are mentioned explicitly in the Quran, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so, but that's a whole topic. Okay, so that would require a lengthy discussion. It's an excellent question. So there are overlaps with some of the categories, and some of them are specific to one school or the other. Okay. Pardon me?
Like the story.
For instance. Okay, so the first point is, it's not limited, it's too cheap to say the narrations that have to do with something missing from the Quran are related to the Shia school. They're there in both schools of thought. They need to be dealt with. One, I'm not going to go into putting them into 4 or 5 categories. Some of our scholars have. I'll put them into 2 big categories. And these would require to be drilled down further because there are subcategories in it. One category is very simply the ones that no scholar considers to be authentic. They are simply very weak ahadith. So they would be dismissed right away. There's either no chain of transmission, or the chain of transmission is full of people that no one has ever relied on for any other hadith, so we would not rely on them here. Or they're unknown. They're people that no one knows who these people are. So I cannot consider this a valid hadith, and this is all well known in the science of hadith. So already we dismissed a whole lot of the narrations that way. The others, there are different meanings to when it says there is tahrif. It does not necessarily mean that the tahrif means something was manipulated in the verse itself. It means that the way people are interpreting the verse is not the original way in which the verse was revealed or what it really means. This is the majority of the hadith that are considered reliable or trustworthy or valid that talk about tahrif. They're talking about tahrif al-ma'na, which means there's a distortion in the meaning of the verse. There's a distortion in the meaning of a word in a verse. Now people have diverted from the true meaning of the verse, the true meaning of the word, to making it mean something else. These are the ones that, and if you go back, let's say, to Sayyid al-Khou'i's book and many, many others, he talks about this and he gives multiple examples, and they're very clear. And if you go back to the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, which are the Imams, they show this in very clear detail. They say people have interpreted the verse as meaning this, when in reality it means that. And then they say this is where the tahrif is happening. Which means the tahrif is not in the words. The tahrif is happening in the meaning attributed to the words, or attributed to the verses. So, the argument for the omission. The first thing is, the author says, if you take into consideration the importance of the Holy Qur'an to the Holy Prophet, to the Imams, to the scholars, and to Muslims, then that becomes an argument on its own that none of these people would ever have allowed omissions to take place in the Holy Quran. That's one argument. A second argument, duplication. If it were possible to duplicate the Quran, then it would also be possible for someone to come and manipulate words in it. And as we said, the problem is if you did that, then you basically know the blueprint of the Quran, and you would know how to play around with it without anyone catching you. You could remove a letter here, or a word there, or a verse here, and the person reading would still say, yeah, this is the Quran, there's nothing wrong with it. So our claim, the claim of the author is, this is not possible. And the argument from duplication proves it. And then we add here, so these were the rational components, and then we add the scriptural. So here the author adds the famous verse from Surah Al-Hijr, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Indeed, it is we who have descended the revelation, for the remembrance, and it is indeed we who are going to preserve it or guard it. وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. Here there are two parts, this verse, and we're not going to get into the interpretation of the verse, but part one is clearly establishing that the Qur'an was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second part is the safety of this Qur'an, the preservation of this Qur'an, the guarding of this Qur'an in that format is going to be preserved, ensured by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a difference of opinion between the scholars about how is that going to be ensured. But clearly, everybody agrees that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making a promise. Just like we saw there was a promise in Surah Al-Rum that this is going to happen and Allah does not break His promise. The same thing can be said about these verses of the Holy Quran. Okay? So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is committing to preserving, guarding the Holy Quran. Now here a question. Why don't we use this word or this verse for the addition? Why don't we say that this verse also means that nothing can be added to the Quran? This verse, to be technical, accurate, we cannot use it to say nothing was added to the Quran. We can only say nothing will ever be missing from the Quran. Why not? Because it would fall under circular logic. What does it mean? Circular logic basically means that a thing ends up depending on itself. It becomes its own cause. I tell you where is the Art Center, you tell me it's close to the Mahdi Center. Okay, where's the Mahdi Center? It's close to the Art Center. If you don't know where the one or the other is, then you've basically told me that the Art Center is, quite close to the Art Center. Who is so and so? Who's Ali? He's Muhammad's brother. Who's Muhammad? He's Ali's brother. Okay, but I'm not any more advanced. This is circular logic. If we're saying here the problem, the thing of contention is there anything added to the Holy Quran? Okay, so we're saying nothing can be added. What if this verse was added? I cannot rely on this verse to say that nothing was added because this verse itself could have been added. So that becomes circular logic. How do we know that no verse was added to the Quran? This verse tells us. Well, how do I know that this verse is not added? Because the Quran tells us. That's circular logic. So I cannot use this verse to establish no addition to the Quran. But I can use it to say nothing is ever going to be missing from the Quran. Okay? Because it's not included in the argument. The verse itself is not included in its own argument that something is missing.
What's the difference between it and the ayah that was used in the addition?
No ayah was used in the addition. The addition is simply to say that one of the arguments was you cannot duplicate it.
Right.
And we only put the verse there as a reference to the argument from the Quran that there's a challenge from the Quran that it cannot be duplicated. But there's a rational argument for the addition, which is it cannot be duplicated. Here, in addition to the rational argument, we're also adding a scriptural argument. Okay, so it works here, but it doesn't work in the addition. A final note that the author makes about the omission. Yeah.
If it's a circular argument.
For the addition only.
For the addition only. So, but then how could you?
So it works for the omission. So I can use this verse to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised in the Quran. So if someone asks me as a Muslim, how do you know that there's nothing missing in the Holy Quran? I tell them, well, I believe in the Quran. And the Quran tells me this verse. So this verse could mean two things. That nothing was ever changed. So nothing was ever added, nothing was ever omitted or removed.
Why can't it mean that? That's the way.
Yeah. So that's why I'm saying, if you mean by it, nothing was ever removed, works.
Yeah.
If you say nothing was ever added, then the devil's advocate, I'll tell you, this verse was added.
Yeah.
So how would you argue that?
I don't use this verse
to
say, I would use the other arguments in addition, which were, you cannot duplicate. Are you talking about a minor addition, or are you talking about an entire theme or entire chapter Well, entire chapter, the Quran says, and it challenges, if you can, duplicate one of its chapters.
Okay, I see.
So can you repeat 2 or 3 verses? Go ahead. But we believe no one has and no one can. So that's my argument for the nothing has ever been added. Otherwise, I would know.
Had a rational argument, right?
Yes, it's a rational argument, and I can corroborate it, or I can add to it from the scripture, which is the verses of the Quran that say, and you cannot duplicate it. And you will fail even if you were to try. Right? We read the verses in previous weeks. Okay? The final point about this is that this does not mean that you may never open a version of the Quran, an actual material book, a manuscript of the Quran. What if you find a typo in it? What if you find a mistake in it? Is this what the verse is saying will never happen? What if you find someone who says this is the Quran and you read it and there's not a word of the Quran in it? As there are attempts of that. There are websites, there are books that have been published that say this is the Quran. And you read and you see there are people who have intentionally introduced new stuff in the Quran. They call them verses and chapters, and you read and it has nothing to do with the Quran. And they're very easily accessible online and in libraries and elsewhere. So is the verse saying this will never happen? No. So in what sense is it preserving? It's preserving in the sense that if someone is looking for the Quran, they will be able to find it. There will not be a state of confusion for humanity of where the Quran is and what it is. That someone may attempt to distort the Quran here, or someone who transcribes the Holy Quran and makes a mistake here or there, he might forget a word or a verse. That will happen. So we're not saying this is a blanket statement that you will never ever find a mistake in the Quran. The statement is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says humanity will always know what is the Quran. You need to look for it. In certain cases, maybe you need to be doing a bit of digging and say, is this the Quran? And then 1.8 billion Muslims will tell you, no, that's not it, this is the Quran. And then you're okay. Okay, that's what the verse means. So it's just so that no one distorts the meaning of the verse. Now let's supplement the lesson with a few points. I'll try to go quickly here. Without trying to be too critical to the manner in which the lesson was presented. The author very quickly told us, if someone studies the history of Islam and the history of this book called the Quran, then it should be very obvious to them that this is the same book that existed at the time of the Holy Prophet. And I would say, given the present context, given the present attacks from Orientalists that started about a century and a half ago, and they're ongoing until now, this is not sufficient. The arguments that we have given, these are not the main arguments that are being attacked. Today, the main attacks against the Quran have specifically to do with that historical context. So that would require a very lengthy discussion and study on its own to see when we say this is the same book, you have to go and acquire expertise in this field. How do we establish that this is actually the same book? They will agree with you that there was a book revealed to Muhammad at his time. So this is, besides the attacks on the Quran, that it's stolen, that it's copied, that large parts of it came from other scriptures. And once they agree with all of that, the Quran itself, now that it's been given to Muslims, they will say that it was not collected during the time of the Prophet, that this collection and compilation into a book only happened much later, and who knows what happened between that time that it was revealed and the time that it was put together, and then there were distortions that took place since the time it was compiled together until today. And they will go into all sorts of libraries and caves and countries in the world to take out manuscripts to show how they differ from today's copies. And Yemen is well known for having some of the oldest manuscripts in the world, and the Quran, they're not available. No one really knows what's in those. They haven't been revealed, no one knows what's in them. In Hadramaut and elsewhere they were found. I don't know how many manuscripts exist. There haven't been, many scholars have claimed that they're working on them, but not a lot of studies have come out to compare what's in those manuscripts with what we currently have today.
Why haven't they been made public since?
Because the authorities there are very difficult in allowing these experts from all over the world to come in and do studies and release copies of them and so on and so forth. But to give you an idea, the majority of these are, pardon me?
How old would they be?
So these would all be from the 1st century of Islam.
Wow.
And this is the issue. These are not there's not a lot of them.
So we have a few of them.
Parts.
Let's say.
What they have in Yemen are full. They are supposed to be full manuscripts of the Quran.
And it's very difficult to get them.
Yes, go try to get one. They are not displayed in a museum for all to see and to study.
Because somebody's doing a public own.
They're somewhere. They're supposed to be. And there are some elsewhere. There are versions in Turkey and Persia. Yeah. But to say like multiple versions and you can sit and do your work as an expert in manuscripts, well, you need to compare different versions. Okay, so this is where the majority of the work is happening today. And the attacks against the Quran are coming from there. If you want to spend time studying this is a field on its own. You need to specialize in who wrote the Quran, where were those copies, where were they kept, what are they called, they all have codes and references, the Uthmani Codex, and they all have names and codes, and they all are ascribed to a certain historical period. There's different dating techniques. You have to go study this from every aspect to see what you accept and what you reject and so on and so forth. If you keep all of this in mind, it becomes a little bit difficult today. If someone has, let's say, a shaky faith in Islam or a shaky faith in the Quran, if you read the volumes upon volumes that are being written against the Quran, attacking it specifically from this angle, I'm not sure the arguments we just gave are sufficient. To say there's a rational argument that says, people want to see the material proof that this is the same book as the one that was revealed. Okay, so this was the compliment that I wanted to give today very quickly. The Bible has the same issue, but they don't make our claim. Because in the Bible, no one claims that this is the same book. It was written 1,200 years later. Parts. We say it's the entire, and it's easy to establish parts. There are many full chapters of the Quran, but from beginning to end. And this is why I thought it's important to keep that in mind. If you want to specialize in this field or just look into it, first study the Holy Quran as like the history of the book. Study it in the time of the Holy Prophet. And I wanted to give you a few examples from this in 5 minutes. You have to study it in the life of the Prophet from the time it started being revealed, to see how he dealt with the Quran. How did he deal with the Quran in Mecca? How did he deal with the Quran in Medina? What did he do during his lifetime? What was the state of the Quran at the time of his passing? And then what happened right after? Like this would require extensive studies to compare what is materially available today, the material, the manuscripts, what we have, the fragments, all of it, and how it was done and the behavior of the Prophet and the Muslims in general. So I wanted to give you glimpses of that. And I intentionally took one book, it's called The History of the Quranic Text, and I have on the last slide, I think I put the bibliography. If I didn't, I'll let you know. It's written by Muhammad Mustafa al-A'zami. This book is written, the reason I mentioned it, there's a lot of books, but this one I found is probably one of the most well-written books in terms of modern academic discourse. So if this is what you're looking for, then this is one of the best books, The History of the Quranic Text. Does not mean that I agree with everything in the book and that there are no problematic points and issues mentioned in the book.
Is he a Shia or?
No. But it is presented as though he is a Muslim scholar specializing in this field, in the field of Hadith and Quran and the manuscript. So it's very much worth a read. If you want to look at the more classic, let's say, treatment of the topic, I would really strongly recommend going directly to Al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Quran. It's one volume that was supposed to become the Tafsir of Sayyid al-Khou'i. In English, it's the Prolegomena to the Holy Quran, to the Prolegomena to the Quran. It is in English, yes. And it's available, and there's an entire section about the authenticity of the Quran where he goes into these topics in depth, in detail. I think enough for anyone who wants to study them, and many other books. But that one, obviously, when it's a marja writing it, then you know this is representative of the entire madhab. And there are other books. Sayyid Tabatabai has also a book, and I've added it in the bibliography references at the end. I put 3 books. Those are the 3. So very quickly, a few quotes from this book, the history of the Quranic text from Al-A'lam. The sea of incentives and opportunities for learning the Holy Book, which means the Holy Quran, coupled with the waves of people involved in disseminating it, soon yielded a prodigious number of companions who had thoroughly memorized it by heart. So he tells us right from the beginning the manner in which the Holy Prophet dealt with the Quran. He taught it to a lot of people, and he asked them to teach it to as many people as they could. Which meant what? Which means that it's being disseminated very quickly. You can't come back and make changes to that, because now it's out there. Right? He's not waiting for the whole thing to be ready, and then he releases one copy, and then you have to track that one copy. And so he gives an example, and we have that, it's very well known, that in one of the battles, perhaps Uhud or others, there were 70 people who were killed who were memorizers of the Quran. Okay? So apart from that, he lists 40 names of people who were known to be the memorizers and the teachers of the Quran early Islam. Some of them were the ones sent to Habasha. Some of them were the ones carrying manuscripts to their tribes. When the Holy Prophet, this is way before, this is in Mecca. Okay? Let's continue. History has not always dealt kindly with scriptures. This was the conclusion of a part of his book. Jesus' original gospel, as well as we shall see later on, which is the entire second half of his book, he compares how the Quran was compiled with the New Testament and the Old Testament. As we shall see later on, was irretrievably lost in its infancy. So at a very early stage, the entire gospel of Jesus ﷺ was lost and replaced by biographical works. So these are what we consider today the gospels of anonymous writers. No one knows who these people were. And if you do any study today, the only reason why they became who they became is after the book was released. You say this was John. This was Matthew. This was Mark. And if you do enough study, you'll see that there are differences of opinion about who John was, for instance. Was it this John or that John? Was it the one who studied under so-and-so? Was it the one who was with Paul? Or is this another one? And then they say, well, there's a unanimous opinion right now that it is, but those opinions are still a matter of study and writing and exploration. Okay? This is why he says, biographical works of anonymous writers lacking any first-hand knowledge of their subject. And if you see when it was written, obviously this was generations after Jesus. Likewise, the Old Testament suffered heavily under chronic idolatry and neglect. And this is why you see so much, when we say we compare the figure of God that we presented, well, that would make sense if you come from a pagan background or you're heavily influenced by it. So that's why he says it's clear that there are influences from idolatry here. There can be no sharper contrast than the Quran, blessed as it was with rapid diffusion throughout the Arabian Peninsula during the Prophet's lifetime, carried forth by companions who had learned his verses and received their teaching commissions directly from the Prophet himself. So if you compare the two manners in which it was compiled and disseminated, it's a very, very strong contrast. Okay? The second question someone may ask here, and as I said, this is like a very high-level overview in 5 minutes. Okay, so who says that this was written? Maybe this was oral, because the Quran was only transmitted orally. Who says that this was in written form? So was it written? Yes, it was written. One example is the many, many narrations that they have about the Islam of Umar ibn al-Khattab. If you go back to the narrations, they say that he was fighting against Islam. And he wanted to come and talk to the Holy Prophet and to dissuade him against continuing to preach. And at some point he became very, very angry. And then when they saw him, apparently he had his sword out and he wanted to come see the Holy Prophet. And one of his friends told him, well, before you do that, you should maybe make sure that no one in your family has entered into Islam. Because if they have, then you should clean that up before going head to head with Prophet Muhammad himself directly. So he couldn't believe it. So he asked, and it was his brother-in-law and his sister and other people of his family who had entered into Islam before him. And when he came in, the reason I'm mentioning all of this, that's the punchline. When he came in, they say some people hid, and his sister took the manuscript that they had and she put it under her to hide it from him. And then they talked back and forth, and this is when he accepted Islam. So if you go back to study his life, you'll see this is how he entered Islam. That early, the manuscripts were written. It was not only an oral tradition. That's the point of this book. Okay? I'm intentionally mentioning this one. Easy to find. Yes?
Some of the verses refer to the Quran being a book, obviously during the time of the Prophet, because they're being...
Yes, al-kitab. Al-kitab means it has to be written.
So does that mean, was it
Compiled?
compiled?
That was going to be my punchline, but I'll give it to you. Yes, it must have been compiled in the lifetime of the Prophet.
No, but at the beginning?
From the beginning.
From the day one of his prophecy, or
Yes.
the middle of his prophecy, or...
It was written, and it was arranged, and it was happening as everything is being revealed.
But
Over
Every
23
time
years.
it's revealed, they add the verse.
And we're going to come to that.
also, it wasn't compiled all of it since when the Wahy came when he was 40.
It would, no,
So it was just...
that's only in the heart of the Prophet. That was entirely revealed to him, but he would not say anything of it until the proper time and place of the verse
Yeah.
is
And then when it was revealed publicly, this verse
that
would be introduced
the
into the book.
scribes would write, and the Prophet would say where to write it and where to put it. Surah and verse. And we're going to mention that.
I heard there was a Munafiq.
I did take a stand there, I know.
Executed because he was found changing some of the verses. Of the
It's
Quran.
possible, but I will not say reliable or not.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I've heard that
Yes,
story
yeah.
actually. So there was during the Prophet
Attempts.
Yeah.
Many.
Yeah.
Yes. Was it written? Yes. In this book, the history of the Quranic text, in this book he lists 65 scribes in the city of Medina. 65 people that were writing the Quran when it was being revealed. If today there is something reported to you by a journalist, how many would you need before you say it's reliable? What if they're reporting it word for word? You have 65 people reporting it to you. Okay, so this is in Medina. So maybe in Mecca it was a little bit different. In Medina, when it was being revealed, we have 65 people whose job it was to write as the Quran was being revealed. This is a direct quote from the book. Upon the descent of the Wahy, the Prophet routinely called for one of his scribes to write down the latest verses. There is also evidence of proofreading after dictations, and then he lists many narrations that show that evidence. Once the task of recording the verses was complete, Zayd, so in that narration, Zayd ibn Thabit, one of the scribes, Zayd would read them back to the Prophet to ensure that no scribal errors had crept in. Okay? What about the arrangement? So now we know that it was all revealed, all written. What about the order of the Quran? And I will openly tell you that if you want to be very objective about this topic, this is the weakest link. But I concede that the arrangement of the surah of the Quran may not be the original one. The author and many, the crushing majority of our scholars say the arrangement of the surah of the Quran is the same as the one that was prescribed by the Prophet. From the time of the Prophet, this is how he said, put the surah, the chapters of the Quran in order.
Even if they weren't revealed to him in that order.
Of course they were not revealed in that order. So he was saying, put them in that order. Notice that I'm talking only about the surah, the chapters. There is consensus 100% about the verses being in the right order. No one has ever said there is a verse that was revealed before or put in a before or after than what we have today within a chapter. If there is a discrepancy, it would be in the order of the chapters. Is it really Al-Fatiha, Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, Al-Nisa, Al-Ma'idah, Al-An'am? Is it really like that? Or maybe one was different. And there are four big opinions. The majority, as we said, is everything is in the same order as the Holy Prophet put it. And huge studies about that because even that is considered miraculous. Opinion 2, the only exception is Surah At-Tawbah. And that's only depending on the theory you follow and how the Quran was compiled. So maybe, depending on that, as a Muslim, not as a, if you follow the Shia tradition, you will not fall under that problem, but others, they may have a problem about Surah At-Tawbah. Is it in the right place or was it actually somewhere else and then put there? Okay? And then another opinion that says this happened, but it happened one generation after. So this was most likely in the time of between Abu Bakr and Uthman. During that time, this is when the order was made and compiled and established formally. And Zayd ibn Thabit, that we just mentioned, is one of the most influential people in that order. And it was done in help with all the other companions. They all agreed on what the Prophet said to put where. Okay, so these are the big opinions. And the one that the majority, the crushing majority of our scholars agree on is the first. That this is the order established by the Holy Prophet himself. So, yes?
Just a side question.
Yeah.
Why is it Surah Al-Baqarah that they have...
Because they say that they came...
Where it's placed.
Yeah, someone came with their manuscript of Surah Al-Tawbah at the end after everything was done. They had put the Qur'an together, and when they brought it, they were not sure where it goes.
Simple as that.
As simple as that.
Okay.
Okay, that's the short answer.
But this only applies to case number 3.
This would be case number 2, because only Surah Al-Tawbah is they're not sure. Everything else is it's in the right place.
Right.
Only Surah Al-Tawbah they're not sure. Case number 3 is no, the Muslims sat together and agreed because the Holy Prophet had left them without a compiled book. But this is rejected by the majority of scholars, that there was no book. It was a book, and the Quran refers to it as Al-Kitab. Because even Orientalists attack the Quran on this. They say it was called Al-Quran because it's something you recite, it's not something you write, therefore it's all an oral tradition. So who knows what was left and what was... No, the Quran refers to itself as Al-Kitab as well, because it was written, as it was being revealed. So it is a Quran and it is a Kitab. But anyways, various reports show that the Prophet actively instructed the scribes about the placement of the verses within the surahs, and then there's multiple narrations to confirm that. Nowhere do we find any reference to a disagreement in the ordering of verses within a particular surah. So Ibn Mas'ud and others, there are versions, manuscripts of the Quran attributed to them, and the Orientalists don't get into the details. They just say, we know that the order is not the same that we have today. It's true, the order of the surah is not the same. But the verses are within the surah, there is no difference. 3. Now, the issue, this is my point. For the rest, so let's agree, the surah, they may not be. The verses, they're all in the right place. The surah, the chapters, may not be in the right place. Fine, let's concede to that. What does that mean?
No.
Anyone who understands the Quran and who knows enough about Islam knows that there is no necessity of having this order of chapters. In fact, the majority of you, and the majority of Muslims anywhere in the world, when you start reciting the Quran and when you start memorizing the Quran, do you start from the beginning or the end?
Yeah.
You start with the end. Okay, if there was a necessity to follow the order for any canonical reason, why would you start from the end? You'd have to start and follow religiously. Islam says this is very important order. No, we'll concede, change the order. So long as you keep the integrity of every chapter of every surah as is, there's no issues. And this applies to prayer, this applies to reading the Quran, memorizing it. It means nothing even if someone would come and say the order of the chapters. But even that we do not concede, because we say there is a reason why the chapters are in the order in which they are in. And inshallah, one day if we go into tafsir, you'll see how the linkages are made between the end of one surah and the beginning of the next. Yes?
Yeah, so are there any hadiths or imams that specify that the Quran has had its order changed? Because you have 12 imams. One of them would have said something like that.
That the order is changed? Yes, we have.
We do?
Yeah, that we have narrations, but we said they are either inauthentic, and so we put them aside, or we say that they are authentic, but they're talking about the meaning of the Quran. When they say there is a distortion.
Specifically like the order of the
The order of
No.
the chapters. Yeah.
No, we actually have the opposite. We have verses that talk specifically, narrations that talk specifically about ordering of the Quran.
And that affirm
Yeah, and
the order that it is today.
And they tell everybody to continue following the order that everybody is reading.
What about the order of verses within a surah?
So
No
we
contention
only have
issue
2
there.
minutes. Let's just focus on that.
No issue there. We don't have a single thing that says the order of the verses is an issue or a contention, disagreement about it. So I'm not going to read that quote. By understanding the need to document every verse, the Muslim community, already swelling with the ranks of the Huffaz, was setting up both an aid to memorization and a barrier to shield the text from corruptive influences. Even the grind of Meccan oppression could not dampen their resolve, and when the Muslims at last enjoyed the prosperity of Medina, the entire nation, literate and illiterate alike, took this task to heart. At the center of this nation resided its energizing focal point, which is the Holy Prophet ﷺ, dictating, explaining, and arranging every verse through the divine inspiration, which was his privilege alone. So the author is saying the only person who could have done this could only have been the Holy Prophet, because this was also part of his inspiration or revelation from God. Okay, till all the pieces and the book. To your question, the book was complete, which means it was complete during his lifetime. Okay, so if you want to go and read all of that. These are 3 of the references if you want to go and look into this topic. As we said, huge contentious topic for a lot of reasons. If you want to look more into it, plug them in to the Qur'an of Sayyid al-Khu'i. Sayyid Tabatabai has a beautiful book, Qur'an in Islam. Amazing book as an introduction to the place and importance of the Qur'an in Islam. And it talks a little bit about the authenticity and the miraculousness of the Qur'an. And the book that we just quoted from, the history of the Quranic text, from revelation to compilation. Yes?
2 very quick questions.
Yeah.
One of the 65 scribes of the Quran, was one of them Imam Ali?
Yes.
Okay. The second one.
So it depends. I need to add something. It depends if you consider him a normal companion or not. So when they list the normal companions, they say that Imam Ali was one of the 65 companions in Medina transcribing the Quran. We do not make him fall into put him in the same category as a normal companion. Okay, and if you study his life objectively, you know that he doesn't fall into that. The Holy Imam Ali has sermons in which he says, I was with the Holy Prophet when every verse was revealed, and he would teach me its apparent or external or superficial meaning.
He was one of the first people who received it from the Prophet.
He was always there, always asking and always writing and always asking about the interpretation of every verse. And this became his version of the Qur'an that people refer to as Mus'haf Ali, just like Mus'haf Fatima, but that's another story, inshallah. He had his own version of the Qur'an, not that it's a different Qur'an. It's that he wrote interpretation and he wrote the teachings of the Prophet in addition to the verses and what they actually meant. Okay, so that's it. Second question?
Second question, are these slides going to be available anywhere?
Yes, they're sent and they will be sent next week, I believe, or during the week. Yes? Question? I'll take it. If it's short. Is it a whole lecture or?
No, it's okay.
It's better to benefit from the question, a good answer next time, because the short answer is not very good.
Next lesson, maybe at the beginning or something. Next lesson, we can ask some question about it.
Sure.
At the beginning or something, I think about it.
Inshallah.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.